Paul, I'd like to ask you about Hiram House, which seemed to influence so much of your life. What exactly was Hiram House, and how did you come to be involved with it?
Hiram House was founded by George Bellamy. On graduation day from Hiram College, he rode his bicycle up to Whiskey Island. That was the place where the immigrants were getting off the boats from Erie and Buffalo. He rented a small home and greeted the immigrants as they came off the boat, helped them get jobs, helped them get indoctrinated, and that started Hiram House in 1896. My first connection with Hiram House came in 1926. I'd arrived at Delbert College to pay my annual tuition, which at that time was $125 a semester. As I walked out after giving Mr. Agnew the money, I noticed a sign on the bulletin board. Woodwork teacher needed Hiram House, $1 an hour, 2723 Orange Avenue. So I drove down to Orange Avenue and met Mr. Bauer, and I was hired, and that began my connection with Hiram House.
So did you continue with that through college and law school?
I continued working for Hiram House until I graduated from law school and took the bar. That was in 1932. While I was at Hiram House, I met Judy Laughlin, who had gone to Muskingum College with Rusk Haverfield and his wife Ruth. And she continuously told me, Haverfield's at Harvard Law School, and when you start to practice, the two of you should meet and practice together. So on August 13th of 32, as I was going down the front steps of Hiram House, she came out to meet me, and she said, "This is the day you're going to meet Haverfield." We were taking the oath at the Engineers Building auditorium, which just recently been torn down. I stood up and I said, "There's a Haverfield in the house." He stood up and I said, "Remain standing till I have a chance to meet you." I went around and shook hands with him, introduced myself, and said, "We're going to practice law together." He said, "I need a job because I'm married." I said, "Mr. Haverfield, there are no jobs, and we better start off together." So we went over to the Leader Building and rented a small office at 460 Leader Building, and that's where we started to practice law.
I understand while you were at Hiram House, you also met your future wife, Susan Hamilton.
I was in charge of Progress City, which was a juvenile city, and in order to be the teachers for that operation, we found students at various colleges who came up for the summer to get credit. She came up to apply for a job on June 12th, 1930 at 4:30 p.m., and it's the first day I met her.
Was it love at first sight?
You're darn right. I walked in and there was this beautiful girl with black curly hair and a red sweater and a black skirt and saddle Oxfords, and I was filthy. I've been upstairs checking the store inventory, and my secretary said, "You better take a shower before you meet her." And when I walked down the steps with her, I think her mother thought the janitor was trying to hire her to be a charwoman. So it took a long time to overcome that handicap, but I fell for her right away, but it took longer for her to fall for me. So a good bit to Hiram House. I met Haverfield, and I met my wife through Hiram House.
So here we were in the year 1932. You were fresh out of law school. You had just passed the bar. You had just met Rusk, who had also just passed the bar. And you had the courage to start your own law practice.
Well, it wasn't so much courage as it is that there are no jobs, and you might as well start to practice. And fortunately, we got along well together, and we've never had a dispute in all the years we've had together, 58 years, and he was the original partner. He took charge of the inside of the operation. I took charge of the outside of the operation. I don't think there's a better lawyer anyway than Rusk Haverfield. He's a good mind, can give you straight information. He's been very, very helpful, and we wouldn't have been successful as a firm if it hadn't been for Rusk Haverfield.
Were there any reservations on his part?
Well, he had come to Cleveland to be sworn in and expecting to find a job with some big law firm. It didn't take very long to disillusion him. There just were no jobs available. If it hadn't been for Haverfield running this office the way he ran it and being on control of the whole situation, this thing would never succeeded. And he was truly the inside lawyer, and he kept meticulous accounting of everything that went on. We never had a problem with a single client. Every money came in for clients, it went in the client's account, and we run that same practice ever since.
So after you opened your door in September, was it September of 32?
September 26th is the day we started.
How did you get your first clients?
Well, when I was at Hiram House, I got well acquainted with scores and scores of families. And during that period of time, quite a few of the Italian husbands had passed away, and they had hired Italian lawyers to help them the probate of the estates. And many of these widows had not gotten anything. So on the day we started to practice, the word had gone out that I was going to be a lawyer. And we got out of the elevator, and there was a group of these women in black mourning clothes waiting for their lawyer. And all of them had a similar problem. They had not gotten any money from their late husband's estates. So our first task as lawyers, Rusk and myself, was to pursue lawyers to get money back for their clients. So that's how we got started in probate law.
I'd like to turn now to how the firm grew in those early years. Tell me first about how you got into municipal law.
And I went to see Harold Burton to see if he'd run for mayor. I had met him when I was just starting to practice. The Cleveland Bar appointed me as president of the junior bar. And every month we had a luncheon meeting and bring in some prominent lawyer. And the first one we brought in was Harold Burton. I was very much impressed with him because he had served as the acting mayor when the managership plan was voted out, and he was acting mayor until Ray Miller was elected in November of 1931. So I thought he would be a fit person to support for mayor, and he couldn't believe that he could be elected. He said if I had all three newspapers and yourself duplicated by 200, I would consider it. So I went to see all the editors of the papers, Nat Howard at the News, Paul Bellamy at the PD, and Louis Selch at the Press, and they agreed that they would support him. And we got a very strong group of people, Roy Jameson, Mr. Ramsey, Earl Hart, and others, and we started a campaign to make him mayor. We were successful in November 1935. At that time, the light plant was in serious trouble because it had been sabotaged for years, and we had represented the widow of Judge Fiedler, who was having problems with the lawyer handling that estate. In doing that, we met Walter Geiser, who was her then husband, and he was employed by the Muni Light Plant. And he told me about the problems they were having, and I talked to the mayor about it. He was very much concerned. So we organized the Cleveland Municipal Light Plant Association. And that association saved the light plant, got it expanded, and developed eventually into a move to take over the streetcar system by the city of Cleveland. In doing this, I got well acquainted with Joe Crowley, who was the special counsel for the law department, and with the other people in the law department. And in 1945, two young men in Cuyahoga Heights, one ran for treasurer and the other for clerk, and they both were elected. And time went on, and on December 31st, 1945, the mayor, Kennedy, and his group had a special meeting of council. And the law provided that if you didn't file your official bond within 10 days of the official count, your office could be vacated. So they vacated the offices of clerk and treasurer and left the boys sitting out in the cold. Well, they went to lawyer after lawyer, and as soon as they saw the statute, they said there's no hope. So they finally got to Joe Crowley. And Joe Crowley told them, go up and see Paul. If he can't do it, no one can do it. So they came in, they had a copy of the statute, and they said, I suppose you'll tell us that nothing can be done. I said, wait a minute. You have a solicitor out there that's paid by the people. He had a duty to come and bring you those official bond forms. Did they ever come near you? No, never heard from him. I filed a suit in the Court of Appeals in mandamus, demanding that they be put in office. At that point, Judge Morgan jumped into it and said, Mr. Green, is this true? Are you paid by the village or by Kennedy? Green said, the village pays me. He said, well, you're supposed to represent all the people in the village. It's your duty to take those forms to these young men. Green said, well, Mr. Kennedy told me I shouldn't do it. Well, said Morgan, I'm surprised. Then Skeel jumped into it. He said, I think we ought to make a ruling from the bench, which they did, 2-1 to put the young men into office. So we won in the Supreme Court, and the following election, they took all the offices. And in January, they came down and asked if I'd be their law director, and that's how we started in practicing municipal law.
I think Solon was another early client.
Well, Mayor Carter of Solon was having very difficult times out there. He wanted to establish an industrial base. The people didn't want any industry. They wanted no commercial developments. They wanted no apartments, but they wanted the best schools and best city service. He realized that with the large geographical area they had, and with the influx of people with children, that they had to establish a tax base. So he came in here 3 different times, each 2-year period, and asked if I'd be their law director and do for them what we had done for Cuyahoga Heights. And I said, we're just too packed up. We just can't do it. The 3rd time, I said, if you'll take Loyal Busher, we'll take care of the assignment. So he met Loyal and agreed to take him. And he said, only one condition, if we need you, you'll be there. I said, okay, that's fine. So we started representing Solon.
Labor law was another early area of the firm. Tell me how we got into that.
Well, we had a lot of unions involved in the light plant and in the taking over the street railway. So we got to know quite a few of the union leaders, and they formed a very deep and lasting association with me. And so I represented some of them in the negotiations. And in 1946, the whole country was upset with railroad strikes, mine strikes. Labor was very unhappy. The war was over, and they were striking every place. And meat rationing was still in effect. And Truman had not taken meat rationing off after the war, and the women in the country were mad. So I was driving with Senator Taft out to Lorraine on a Friday evening before the election. I said, you know, Bob, I think Republicans will control the next Congress. So he took out a yellow pad and began going down the list. He said, I think you're right. I said, you can have any chairmanship you want, appropriations, foreign relations, but the one you've got to take is labor and education. He said, why is that so important? I said, because if you don't take it, Fred Hartley will draft the labor law, which will be very oppressive, and I think you got the character and background that you can get a decent labor law passed. Now, much to everybody's surprise, the 80th Congress was Republican, and Taft announced that he was taking the chairmanship of that committee, and that started a very interesting 4 or 5 months of hearings, and finally the Congress passed the Taft-Hartley law.
You were instrumental in drafting that?
I helped in that in a number of respects, and because I had a lot of experience in labor background, Senator Taft talked to me many times. Meet at the Harvey restaurant down in Washington to discuss some problem, and he said to me, what do you think is the most important thing in labor relations? I said, a cooling off period. He said, well, what would you say, 30, 60, 90 days? I said, no, that sounds too much like a promissory note. Let's take 80 days, from 80 days around the world. And so there's an 80-day period now in the Taft-Hartley law before the parties can go out on their own.
Paul, how did we get our first labor client?
The very first case I had before the World Labor Board was in January 1942. There's a company called Weaver Wall, and it had a dispute with the Carpenters Union. We had a hearing in the Old Holland Hotel, and when the hearing started, Mr. Wall had his back to the table, and the Schwarzer brothers of the Carpenters Union had their backs to the table. And we got the word pretty fast that these folks wouldn't talk. So I talked to the members of our panel, one representing labor and management. We went out of the room and talked, and we came back and we said, if you folks don't talk, we'll have an order prepared that the government will take your plant over. This got their ears up, and they turned around, and we went through the procedure and finally issued a decision. Well, sometime after that, about a year later, I got a call from Mr. Wall. He said, you know, you're our new lawyer. Well, I said, there's 2 sides of that. I haven't agreed to represent you yet. Well, he said, come out here at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. I went out, and he had a plant in which there was a steps down from the office into the plant. I went to the top of the steps. He had all his people lined up in 2 rows. He yelled out, this is our new lawyer. He took me down there to meet all of them. I got back to his office. He said, you can't very well say no now, can you? You'll have to represent us. So that started representation that continued for many years. And
that led to Cooper Tire?
Well, later on, I was called on to arbitrate a very difficult case involving Cooper Tire. The president of the union had become a maverick and was destroying the union with his position. And so they wanted to have an arbitrator go down and take the heat and see what could be done. When we were finished with that case, we sustained a discharge, and I heard no more about it. Sometime later, I got a call from Mr. McMenamin and from Wayne Brewer asking if they'd come up and see us. And Mr. Brewer, his father, had said to them, it appears to me you ought to get in touch with Walter up there in Cleveland to see if he'll handle our labor relations. So they came up, and I met both of them, and we introduced them to Rusk. And we asked them if they make up their minds, let us know. So I was talking to Rusk, and a few minutes later they came back and said, we made up our minds, so I'd like to have you represent Cooper in our labor relations. So we've represented them ever since that time, and young Mike McMenamin, the son of John McMenamin, is the key lawyer now that's handling those disputes all over the country.
Beyond the clients we have mentioned, what other clients were important to the firm's early growth?
Well, in the middle 30s, National Dairies that had Telling Bell Vernon in Cleveland had advertised a squeeze neck bottle, and they said a dipper spoon. So a person could put the spoon in the small neck of the bottle and pour off the cream and then bring out the milk. So they had implanted that in this market for many years as one of their features why people should buy milk from Telling Bell Vernon. Someone invented a method to homogenize milk, to mix the cream in with the milk. So they abandoned that and started homogenizing milk. And to protect themselves, they had an ordinance passed to pay inspectors $300 a month to be present while milk was homogenized. Well, Benny Scarcella, who'd been one of my Hiram House boys, came in to see me, and he said, this is very unfair to the 72 small dairies in Greater Cleveland. Would you represent them and get this ordinance knocked out? So we formed a corporation called Milk Incorporated, and all the small dairies carried that logo on their trucks, and they successfully knocked out the ordinance, and there was no small dairy that could either buy the equipment or pay $300 a month for inspectors. So we got that out of the throat of the Cleveland milk drinkers, and from then it went more smoothly.
So from those contacts, we obtained Lawson's as a client?
When the milk market orders were finally settled and things settled down, Lawson had been in to see us a number of times. I told him we could not represent them as long as we represented the rest of the industry because there was a severe dispute between them. So McEnroth came in one day and asked if he could have us represent Lawson. And at that time, the work with the other dealers was finished, so we said yes. And our first case involved an injunction to prevent the co-op from interfering with our producers. And Judge Connell gave us a judgment that day, and from then on we represented Lawson's in many, many matters.
Any other early clients you want to mention?
Well, I met Mr. Manners through Ramona Newton, who married him, and we represented him in a number of matters, and he got into business with a person out in Bedford in a food and feed and coal business, which didn't satisfy him. So we came in and talked, and we finally decided that going the restaurant business would be a smart idea. And so we had $1,200 between us, and we went out looking for a location. And we found a large piece of land east of Euclid Beach Park on Lakeshore Boulevard, which had 2 old garage buildings on it. Since we didn't have enough money to start a restaurant sitting down people, we filled the 2 garages with a bunch of old junk cooking equipment. And on the 1st of July, we opened and advertised we had a drive-in restaurant. And the crowds of people were so great that the police came in and asked if we couldn't do something to slow it down. But it was very popular. It was the first drive-in restaurant, and our curb girls used to run out in the cinders and serve the food and bring the money back. When the kids saw that big boy figure reading at Manners, and that was the big attraction, that big boy, without people understanding or reading or writing, could see the symbol, and that's where we built the business up. We finally had about 54 restaurants by the time Con Foods took them over.
I'd like to talk briefly about some of the other lawyers who were important to the firm's growth. Let's start with Loyal Busher, and tell me the skills that he brought to the firm.
Loyal Busher, parents aptly named him Loyal Victor Busher. He had loyalty and he liked to win. He was a great golfer, and he and his father never played golf, they ran golf. The moment they teed off, they'd start to run. If you played golf with him, you might as well have sat on the bench because you never kept up with him. But he was a very interesting person, an excellent lawyer, very thorough, and he got the point very quickly. And we got him into the milk market area, and he was excellent at it. And we also got him into the work with Lawson, and we got him in the field of municipal law. And people liked him, they liked his wife. And out in Solon, after he passed away, they dedicated the recreation room out on that publicly held golf course and have his picture over the mantel. He had a very nice ceremony dedicating it, but the high respect people had for him was wonderful. And it's a shame he ever quit practicing law at the age he did, because he had great, great talent. And people liked him, and that was a very important thing. On Wilson Chalkley, he came in after the war. He'd been a prisoner in Germany, and he was anxious to practice law, and we took him on board. And he came from a entirely different social strata than Loyal did. He was in Lakewood and highly thought of, and he brought a different class of clients in the office. And as he grew, the clients grew. And he was very close to Bob Church, who was the chief counsel for Stored Broadcasting, working out of Miami. And because of that relationship that he had with Duke, that brought Stored Broadcasting in the office as a client, which was a very important relationship, and has continued through many years. And right now, Bob Church is associated with our office in Miami. So these practices are built brick on brick. You do one thing one day, and that's the first brick. Another brick comes on top of it. Pretty soon you have a practice built on a very strong wall. And we find that's how it works out. Now, Bob Musser served in the war. He came in, and the first thing that impressed me was he was tall and lanky. And I figured he was starving, so he'd be a good lawyer. And it didn't take him long to get on the ropes, and we started putting him in the municipal law field as well, and he got into the real estate activities with Manners, and he also, through that relationship, strengthened our relationship with other clients that we had gained through Manners. And he has produced the ability to hold on to clients. I don't think he's ever lost one, and it's because he knows how to devote himself to a client's interest and keep close to their real problems. And that's the biggest thing a lawyer can do, is be there when the bell rings. Art Steinmetz had served in the Army, and he had served in Europe. And when he came back, he came in and looked for a place to practice. I was pretty much impressed with Art. He seemed to be very thorough and seemed to have a knack for detail, and that sort of rounded out the team we had. And so Art came on board, and we began to hand over to him matters of pensions and corporate work, and gradually he has developed the original group of clients into more clients because they've been impressed with his performance. And through the years, he's a very steady influence on the firm. Strangely enough, I think we're the first law firm to hire a woman. I used to be down in the office at 2 o'clock in the morning. I'd go over, we got the last bus out to University Heights. And John Adams from Squire Sanders met me down there one morning. He said, "You look to be working as hard as I'm working." Well, I said, "I sure could use some help." But as I know a woman lawyer that you ought to talk with. The next morning, I got in the office, and there was a phone call. And this woman introduced herself as Isla Johnson. I said, "Well, what can I do for you?" She said, "Well, John Adams called me and said that you needed a lawyer." Well, I said, "When can you come down to be interviewed?" She said, "I'm right downstairs in the payphone. I'll be up right away." So we hired Isla Johnson. And
Tell me the story of Isla and the judge.
first time I had her go down to a court, she went with me and was appeared before Judge Bear, who was a little tiny fellow. And we were in a divorce matter, and I put her in the #1 chair. We represent the woman, and the man was represented by a lawyer on the other side of the table. As he was arguing his case, Isla kept objecting. The judge admonished her a few times and finally said to her, "Young lady, if you don't keep your mouth shut, I'll find you in contempt of court. You've got a lawyer behind you that can take care of you." The young lawyer on the other side of the table said, "But Judge, she is a lawyer." At that point, Bear scurried off the bench and almost tripped himself in his robes to apologize. Within an hour, the whole bar knew about the initiation of Isla Johnson of the practice of law.
Can you tell me about Senator Taft and the presidential campaign?
In '52, when Bob lost the nomination, my secretary, Mary Co. Wells, I had her up there, and she was in charge of the war room, where we had all the delegates listed, and we knew exactly where they were all the time. We had a boilerplate operation with young men on tables with phones, keeping in touch with everybody. When the thing was over, Eisenhower came over to meet Taft, and they met in that room with her. And neither of them ever told me what they said, and she wouldn't tell me either. So all three people in that conversation are gone, and we still don't know what was said to each other. But in that exchange, there was a pledge made by Taft that he'd support Eisenhower strongly. Well, Eisenhower began to run like a dry creek, and he was in a lot of trouble. And Bill Summerfield, the national chairman, asked me to meet him in Columbus at a side table at the airport, which we did. And he said, Paul, you have everything you want if you can get these Taft people stirred up. Because we had people from the Rockies over to the Appalachians were Taft territory. So I told him that there's nothing we could do until Bob Taft's principles were adopted by Eisenhower. And Summerfield called Taft and said, I'd like to fly you out to Cleveland. This was Sunday night. I have a plane waiting at the airport. Let's have breakfast. We'll fly to Cleveland. So Bob called me. I said, what they want you to do is arrive at the airport at the same time as Eisenhower does. Don't come. About 9 o'clock, he called me and said, you were right. That's exactly what they wanted to do. So when I came into town about noon, he was madder than hell. Where's Taft? Well, of course, Taft wasn't here. And then he had a meeting with the people here in Cleveland, and he said, I'll support the Taft-Hartley law. I'll do this. I'll do that. As fast, he said, I would leak it to the press. So Taft kept calling, saying, what's going on out there? Well, I said, Eisenhower is wanting your support. Time is getting right.
So what happened after the 1952 presidential election?
After the Congress became Republican, Taft became the majority leader. In a few months' time, he and Ike became very, very close. In about February, I had a bad accident and had a bad leg. And I went down to see Taft about a month later. And he'd been playing golf with Eisenhower down in Georgia. And he came out of the well of the Congress, and we went over for his office. And as he went around the corner, he started to limp. I said, Bob, if that's a sympathy limp, you got the wrong leg. So by the time we got down to his office, he had his key to the private door, and he winced. We went over to have dinner, and during dinner, he got so painful that he could hardly stand it. I suggested he see a doctor, and he was up all night fighting the Midlands offshore oil leases with Wayne Morris, who was filibustering. Well, I didn't see him again in about a month, and by that time he didn't look too well. And I saw him in June. He called me to come down and have dinner with him. And we were going out to Martha Roundtree. She owned the Meet the Press. Mrs. Taft had a stroke in 1950, so he asked her to go with Jack Martin and Barbara. He was Taft's administrative assistant to the Roundtree affair, and he would have dinner with me at his home, which we did. And he said, Paul, I think we got to choose an acting majority leader while I'm in the hospital in New York. Well, we decided to ask Nolan because he was rich, had every chance of being reelected, and we thought he'd make a strong leader. So the next day on crutches, Taft goes to the Senate and announces that Nolan will be taking his place till he got back from the hospital. So the last week in June, he called me and said, I'll be up in New York, and the Senate has to be put to bed by July 31st. Would you come down here and run the majority leader's office? So I did. And that was very interesting because we were running the country, and senators would come in and ask, is the language in the bill that the senator said he'd have? And I would call Jack Martin. He would talk to Taft, and we'd relay back and forth. By the end of the month, it became clear that he was not going to make it. He passed away on July 31st, and that ended an era. But it was quite a thrill running the country for 30 days and learning a lot about all the other senators.
Tell me also about your involvement with world peace and nuclear disarmament.
We stayed very close to Kennedy, and in the spring of 1963, he called Norman Cousins and myself to come to the White House, and he said, if I got a nuclear test ban treaty, I couldn't get it through the Senate. He said, I have about 27,000 letters here last week. Half of them we threw out because we couldn't understand them, and the other half were from kids asking for help on projects. But of the balance, only 100 letters were here on nuclear disarmament, all written by some little lady in Washington who took the telephone book and sent 100 letters every week. She said, we'll have to get an atmosphere created to have the country ready to accept it. So we went to work, and we had every organization we could get in Washington sending out letters. And in August, we got a call to come down, and we went down. He said, I have a treaty. But he said to me, Paul, I cannot pass the Senate unless you get Dirksen to support it. I went to see Everett, and he said, Paul, I have grandchildren and great-grandchildren turning along. I don't want them all burned up. He said, you tell Mr. President that I'll have a bigger percentage of Republicans and he'll have Democrats. And he said, I got Goldwater on my right and I got Javits on my left. And to get those two guys through together is like taking a camel through the eye of a needle, but I'll get it done. He said, when I come down to work every morning, I see all those wheels going, and I figure there's a little oil here, a little oil there. And so I'll put that little oil here, and I'll get it through. So it came about September. He called and said, you can tell Mr. President I have the votes. And so they called it out on the floor, and it was passed. And that's how the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty came into effect.
Paul, I know you've got some strongly held beliefs. Tell me a little bit about your philosophy of practicing law.
Practicing law is casting your bet upon the waters, and it'll come back 100-fold. Most of my time, I'd say 80% of my time has been given, doing things I never got paid for. So I worked like the devil the other 20% to keep alive. But in that capacity, I was involved with the YMCA. I had to join the Y in 1918. I became president of the Student Y at Reserve, and in 1932, Ned Worthington got me involved with the Cedar Y, and I was chairman of their membership drive for 5 years and raised the money for the new building. I became chairman of the camp board of the Y and served on that capacity for 28 years and became president of the Y. My association with Hiram House continued all these years until presently I'm now the chairman of the board at Hiram House. And about 15 years ago, I've been interested in the Western Reserve Historical Society, and I became president of that in 1980. And 2 years ago, I became chairman of the board, and Fred Crawford became the honorary chairman. But that's been a very enlightening experience and has also been very helpful. The practice of law is, as I told you earlier, you've got to take care of people when they're hurting, and you can't put them off. And we've had a pretty good reputation on people call me at 2 o'clock in the morning, call me at 3 o'clock in the morning, they got a problem, and we go ahead and take care of it.
Paul, and one last question. Of all the many things you've done over the years, what one or two make you the proudest?
Marrying my wife. I was very fortunate because she had to put up with an awful lot, having me in all these various things and going in and out so often. But I think the last month of Senator Taft's life, when I was in his office helping get that Senate put to bed, and I think the passage of the Test Ban Treaty was also important. So I have nothing but faith in the future as far as the firm is concerned. I wish I could live another 100 years to look back and see how it grew and